Mark Twain was always given credit for saying that, particularly in California, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over, and that kind of sums up our whole approach to water management, at least out in the West.
The Chinese, the symbol for water, not only means water, it means control, which I think is quite profound in the sense that controlling water is everything.
According to research, in order for a culture to maintain itself for more than 25 years, there must be a fertility rate of 2.11 children per family. With anything less, the culture will decline. Historically, no culture has ever reversed a 1.9 fertility rate. A rate of 1.3, impossible to reverse, because it would take 80 to 100 years to correct itself. And there is no economic model that can sustain a culture during that time. In other words, if two sets of parents each have one child, there are half as many children as parents. If those children have one child, then there are 1/4 as many grandchildren as grandparents. If only 1 million babies are born in 2006, it's hard to have 2 million adults enter the workforce in 2026. As the population shrinks, so does the culture. As of 2007, the fertility rate in France was 1.8, England 1.6, Greece 1.3, Germany 1.3, Italy 1.2, Spain 1.1. Across the entire European Union of 31 countries, the fertility is a mere 1.38. Historical research tells us these numbers are impossible to reverse. In a matter of years, Europe as we know it will cease to exist. Right now, Canada's fertility rate is 1.6, nearly a full point below what is required to sustain a culture. In the United States, the current fertility rate of American citizens is 1.6. With the influx of the Latino nations, the rate increases to 2.11, the bare minimum required to sustain a culture.
The water wars. The recent visions of the tsunami rushing, raging, tearing through the Asian coasts has given us all some interesting insights into the truly stunning and indeed awesome power of water and how nature's fury is virtually boundless when unleashed. Yet there is another watery war that is being waged that may affect the lives of billions, but it garners neither the concern nor really the attention of the world's media. The electronic media, especially, thrives on drama and conflict and seeks pictures and stories which reflect those features. It also affirms the positions of the privileged as opposed to the plight of the poor and powerless. Yet all across the globe, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and even here in North America, people are living under the very real threat of the corporatization of water and water systems. The waters of the earth, which have been since the dawn of human civilization for the collective usage of the community, is fast becoming just another commodity, something to sell. If you can afford it, cool. If not, tough. Michael Stark, a senior executive at U.S. Filter, a subsidiary of the multinational corporation Vivendi, put it this way: water is a critical and necessary ingredient to the daily life of every human being. and it is also an equally powerful ingredient for powerful manufacturing companies. Veronica Lake, a Michigan-based environmental activist, has noted that corporations acquire the world's water by three major methods. A, by water mining the underground aquifers or deep sources of many of the world's streams or rivers. B, by leasing state and government water systems and collecting revenues. And C, by managing city water systems. In short, there's money in water, and where money is, there too are corporations trying to get paid. That's the dark, unforeseen, and treacherous side of the globalization movement among Western governments and corporations. That's also what privatization really means, taking the common inheritance of nature and making it into someone else's private property. In South Africa, this movement has resulted in more misery for the poor. Indeed, cholera rates are higher now there than in the days of apartheid. It's often the result of tough austerity measures imposed by the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, where governments are privatizing essential services, and the cost of living now means the right to buy water to live. Nor is this merely a story for the distant third world. In Detroit, Michigan today, some 40,000 people on the southwest side have had their water shut off for non-payment. In many older buildings, water isn't just the stuff that's supposed to run through faucets. It also provides steam heat through old radiators. So, no water means no heat. In Detroit, scholars say that the next world wars will be fought not for oil, but for water, for it is infinitely more precious. Thankfully, people all over the world, in South Africa, in Ploshimata, India, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in France, Ghana, and Canada, are fighting both their sellout governments and the corporations for the human right of free access to water. Those of you who have heard my earlier pieces may remember the Bolivian water wars in a place called Cochabamba. There, a popular group calling itself La Coordinadora de Defensa del Agua y de la Vida, the Defense Committee in Defense of Water and Life, organized the poor, the homeless, the streetwalkers, and everyone they could to oppose the corporatization of their water. They ran out the Bechtel Corporation. It must spread, or else water will become as rare as gold and as expensive.
Chris Ann Hall says, "You cannot define liberty. How can you defend it?"
Did you know that the whole family, not just children, can benefit by drinking water that contains fluoride? It's a fact that in addition to brushing and flossing, the best way to keep your teeth is to drink fluoridated water.
Fluoridation of community water is extremely safe and extremely effective in preventing tooth decay. Science is on the side of fluoride being safe and effective. There is no controversy about this in the scientific community.
You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
In the small county of Elbit, Georgia, on one of the highest hilltops, stands a massive granite structure known as the Georgia Guidestones. Perfectly aligned with celestial bodies, this American Stonehenge was erected sometime in the late 70s. The enormous structure stands almost 20 feet high, is made of 6 granite slabs weighing in at almost 250,000 pounds. The most astonishing detail of the monument is not its size, but the messages that are carved into it. Engraved in 8 modern and 4 ancient languages are 10 commandments for a new age of reason. The first directive is the most sinister and alarming to us all. Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. How do you suppose they plan on eliminating over 90% of the population? Perhaps by using the oldest trick in the book, and that is to do it right under our noses, then cloak it in the phrase, "It's all for your own good." Our food, our air, and our water are all under attack, and the most disturbing part is that it's by design.
In the final analysis, there's only one way to cap a population: by deciding who's permitted to live, and who, for the good of all, must die.
If children knew what was really in our water, they'd be even more frightened. bacteria, toxins, and other pollutants have made over 40,000 bodies of water too polluted to be used as a source for our drinking supply. You need water. Water needs you. Tell President Obama to protect, not weaken, the Clean Water Act.
The governor just passed legislation that said it's a right of every individual to have clean, potable water.
Product. See, that's what this has become. In one of capitalism's sacrifice zones, a resource vital to the survival of all living things is considered just another commodity. And as long as this society keeps treating water as a product that can be privatized instead of shared among the commons, we have zero moral high ground to impose humanitarian ideals on anyone else.
Water is becoming increasingly important in geopolitical spheres. What if the next war isn't fought over geopolitical dominance or ideology? What if the next war is a desperate struggle over water? Water scarcity remains a source of conflict in the modern day. Both the US and the United Nations believe these conflicts will escalate in the future. The US Director of National Intelligence's office issues some unsettling predictions. Although the Global Water Security Report states that a water war will be unlikely within the next 10 years, it doesn't stop there. Beyond the 10-year mark, the report estimates that the use of water as a weapon will also become more likely. Some institutions argue that privatization may be the best way for developing countries to acquire the infrastructure necessary to supply clean water, but this approach has mixed results, leading to social unrest when local populations cannot afford the prices set by private utility companies. While defenders of privatization argue that this is the best way to create the infrastructure, locals and indigenous rights groups often accuse the corporations of practicing resource extraction, using water for export purposes, industrial use, or political leverage.
I think Wall Street per se understands this is the commodity to be invested in.
There are at least a dozen publicly traded water indexes that deal only with water, trading it on the open stock market. 5 years ago, this didn't exist. Now it's just simply exploding.
It takes two players to really make the corruption happen. First of all, we have corporations who are often greedy, but corporations are not social service agencies. They're there to make a profit. And what happens too often is that the water hunters are able to come in and either the government is corrupt or the laws are not sufficient to protect the water resources. In our legal framework, corporations have the same rights as citizens, and so we see
Nestle at their plant outside of Sacramento sucking 80 million gallons of water a year off of Sacramento to sell it.
When you have a change in government, the previous government's commitments are subject to renegotiation, and that's just the way it is. So when you're looking at water owned by someone else that you have to get a contract with, that's not a secure commodity anymore. The only way to have a secure commodity is to create it yourself by desalination.
There are 87 corporations now building desalination plants, and the biggest water company of all is General Electric, followed by Procter & Gamble and Dow Chemicals getting into it. These are all companies that have seen the writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall is that water is the hottest property out there.
Dasani is not meant to be a substitute for municipal supply, so we are absolutely in support of robust, comprehensible, and equitable water and sanitation systems.
The fact that there aren't more plants in the world is because it's a cost factor.
Only rich countries or the World Bank or big corporations or a combination of all three are going to be able to afford to build desalination plants.
But even on the slim chance that technology can advance quickly enough, that the energy costs and needs lower enough to make a global desalination solution possible, the question still remains, why? Why forfeit the water we already currently have? Why freely give it to others only so they can sell it back to us at whatever cost the demand allows?
When you have communities that are looking to extend their water supplies, they'll pay what they feel the value of that supply is worth.
When water is jointly owned by someone who is a capital interest, a private interest, a profit interest, and government, I see abuses on both sides.
Today, most water systems are state-run. This arrangement leaves much to be desired.
When water is only owned by the government, you have an opportunity for abuse.
We consume it every day with the reassurance from our health authorities that it's doing us good. The truth is, fluoride is a poison, and adding it to our drinking water is an evolving social experiment started 40 years ago.
This is called water fluoridation. When dentists and doctors say they support fluoride in the water supply, what they're really saying is that they support the mass poisoning of the population with a highly toxic, hazardous waste product that, if it weren't dripped into the water supply, it would have to be disposed of as a highly toxic, hazardous waste under strict EPA regulations.
What we're doing in the fluoridated community is we're doing to everyone what a doctor can do to no one.
Fluoride is being put in specifically to alter you physically, to make a physical change in you.
Fluoride is a drug, is a medicine.
Cities and towns all across the world actually dump it into the water supply, hoping to indiscriminately medicate the population through their tap water faucets.
Water fluoridation is the dispensing of a drug.
This is not chlorine. This is not any number of the other chemicals that are used to treat the water.
Most people in America are persuaded that everybody fluoridates their water.
The countries now that have banned the use of fluoride, China, Austria, Belgium, Finland, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Hungary, and Japan. All these countries have said that fluoride, number one, is ineffective and toxic and should not be used. We are still using it. There's something wrong here.
What if fluoride isn't good for us? Sure, it helps our teeth and bones grow, but at what cost? To understand exactly what fluoride is and how it came to permeate our water supply, we'll need to look back through history.
As I began my quest looking into the history of fluoride, I found what seemed to be a tangled web of information. While we agree that there are a number of different players in this game and paths to explore regarding the history on fluoride, for the sake of time, we will attempt to be as concise as possible. In the last part of the 18th century, a new kind of revolution was taking hold of the modern world. This was not a political, social, or cultural revolution. This was an economic revolution, and unfortunately for us, the byproducts were some of the most toxic pollutants humanity had ever seen. And one of the most venomous pollutants of them all was fluoride. By 1930, the aluminum industry was the biggest polluter of fluoride. In America, only one company was in the aluminum business: the Aluminum Company of America, otherwise known as Alcoa. Ironically enough, during that time, the U.S. Public Health Services was under the direct jurisdiction of the U.S. Treasury Secretary Andrew W. Mellon. It just so happened that Mellon was a founder and major stockholder of Alcoa. He was also the founder of the Mellon Institution, an industry-funded research institute that was notorious for giving industry the scientific data it needed to defend itself. The Mellon Institute published some of the key evidence that supported the effectiveness of fluoride in fighting tooth decay. It was Dr. Gerald Cox, who also worked at the Mellon Institute, that made the first proposal to artificially fluoridate our public water supplies. Although widely debated, the official human experiments began in Grand Rapids, Michigan on January 25, 1945, as they were the first to publicly fluoridate their water supply.
There's all kinds of research out there showing it really disturbs the functioning of the body in a number of ways. Inactivates 62 enzymes, increases the aging process, increases the incidence of cancers and tumors up to 17%, disrupts the immune system, causes genetic damage, interrupts RNA and DNA, repair enzymes activity, increases arthritis, and is a system poison. These are all validated by scientific data.
And so fluoride accumulates in calcium-rich tissues, which are bone, ligaments, cartilage, joints, and teeth.
Have you ever heard of dental fluorosis?
No.
No. It comes when somebody's overexposed to fluoride.
That's a picture of very mild dental fluorosis, and so is that.
They say 41% of American teenagers have this condition.
So this is the white spot. So it's been there. It's a little scary, knowing that many people, we don't even know, what's in our water.
The first signs that fluoride is poisoning your bones is pains in the joints, stiffness in the joints. We have millions of people with arthritis in the United States and in fluoridated countries, 1 in 3 adults.
Are bones with more fluoride stronger or less strong? And the answer is less strong. They got studies where they tried to give them a dose of fluoride, sodium fluoride, to cause an increase in bone mass. It did, but it weakened the bone itself. So those are case-controlled studies. That's the gold standard in medicine. So we have case-controlled studies showing that if you give people fluoride, it accumulates in their bones and it causes the bones to become white, opaque, increases the bone density, decreases the bone tensile strength. And they showed that the more fluoride in the bone, the quicker it snaps.
If you ever wonder, how come everybody has hip replacements, knee replacements? I mean, you can go on and on.
So you have to look at this as if you have a lifetime body burden, and the less you're exposed to, the longer you can go before you develop symptoms.
How does it end up in our bones? Is that where our body just finds?
It's calcium-rich tissue, so your body parks it there because it's got to dispose of it some way, otherwise it would kill you. So it parks in the bone and then it kills your bones. What it does once it fills up with fluoride, that you get little spikes on the outside of the bone. If you take a hand and take a bone and run your hand up and down a normal bone, it's slick, and that's because muscles move around on the bones when you're running or jogging or lifting weights and all that stuff. Your muscles are moving around on your bone, and it's slick, so it doesn't hurt. Well, if you make that bone the texture of sandpaper, then when the muscle moves around, the fascia tears, and it hurts to move.
When they first started using fluoride, they used sodium fluoride. And sodium fluoride that we were able to get from the aluminum industry. Well, the fluoride that is being put in the water now, not back in 1940, 1950, that was sodium fluoride. Now it's a mineral. It's coming from the phosphate fertilizer industry.
The problem is phosphate is often contaminated with high levels of fluoride, as much as 40,000 parts per million, or up to 4% of the raw ore. To remove the fluoride, sulfuric acid is added to a wet slurry of phosphate and water. This causes the fluoride to vaporize, creating highly toxic gaseous compounds such as hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride.
If either chemical is consumed in high amounts over a lifetime, it can lead to cancer, skin conditions, bone disease, and other health issues.
Curiously, it is a violation of federal law to dump hexafluorosilicic acid or sodium silicofluoride into the water. Such an act, in fact, is considered an act of terrorism. These toxic fluoride chemicals used to be released directly from the smokestacks of phosphate mining operations, but the nearby farms suffered devastating losses of cattle and food crops, which withered away and died due to, guess what? Fluoride poisoning. In order to stop this environmental destruction, the phosphate mining industry put in place a way to capture the toxic fluoride chemical vapors so that they wouldn't be released into the air and kill the surrounding livestock and vegetation. It is really a clever way for industry, the mining industry, chemical processing industries, aluminum smelting and processing industries, to eliminate their toxic industrial waste without having to pay for it to be handled as industrial waste. This was accomplished by installing wet scrubbers that captured the toxic fluoride chemicals, preventing them from being released into the environment and killing the plant and animal life living nearby. It is from these wet scrubbers that toxic fluoride chemicals are now harvested. They're collected, repackaged, shipped to your local city, and then dumped into the municipal water supply. So instead of these toxic fluoride chemicals being released by the phosphate mining smokestacks, they are instead captured and then released into the water supply of large cities, where the chemicals then contaminate the water of millions of people at a time.
The water is supposed to have fluoride in it, but Rob Damaris has been concerned for years about what's in the supply he gets from China. The residue you see here is what won't dissolve when he puts the fluoride powder in the water. What is that?
We don't know.
You have no idea what's in there.
I don't know what it is. It's not soluble, and it doesn't appear to be sodium fluoride, so we're not quite sure what it is.
Vast majority of the disposal of their hazardous waste product. That means that you and I and our children in the United States are the largest consumers of hydrofluosilicic acid. Call it what it is. Hydrofluosilicic acid, what is that? Hydro is water, fluo, fluoride, silicic, sand, and it's missing an electron, it's acidic.
Fluoridation is the worst recycling practice in the world. So I support recycling. But to take the hazardous waste from the phosphate fertilizer industry, which cannot be dumped into the sea by international law and cannot be used locally because it's too concentrated, and to take that product and put it into our public drinking water is sheer lunacy.
San Diego is not being forced to fluoridate. They're doing voluntarily against the law that we have in our community. So what do you do about that? The only thing I know to do about that is exactly what all the people in Libya and Egypt and the Middle East did, is that when you get sick and tired of the totalitarian approach to government, where they says you will drink it, you're going to like it, we decided you need to have hazardous waste in your water supply, and you got to stand up and say, you know what? You drink it, because I don't want it. This is a sad day where the citizens of San Diego lost again. We held them off for 60 years, and here they are, buying Chinese hazardous waste, put it in the water supplies of San Diego, directly against our wishes. If you catch the citizens asleep, you can take their rights away, and that's what they did.
That's what it was.
People just, are not savvy enough to be able to figure out that the hazardous waste from China is not what's going to prevent tooth decay. Eating right and taking care of your teeth is what prevents tooth decay. This is about your rights. This is a civil right. Are we going to put stuff in the water that harms children?
We shouldn't.
Well, we did.
The majority of our prescription drugs, the primary ingredient is fluoride. Fluoride is a drug.
Oh, I didn't know that. No idea.
Well, anytime you see the letters FLUO, you're talking fluoride. Fen-phen, the diet drug that ruined hearts, well, that was a fluorinated diet drug. Prozac is fluoxetine. It's a fluorinated psychoactive. Matter of fact, almost all your psychoactive drugs are fluorinated drugs. They put it in there both as a carrier and an accelerator of the effect.
SSRI drugs are similar molecularly to some of the elements in fluoride. Remember the school shootings in Columbine, Colorado? They were on SSRI drugs. Those drugs make your mind think that you're not living in the real world, that you're actually just sort of experiencing a false reality.
Knowing this, that it is a drug, do you think it's safe to allow the population to be drugged at any dose? Doesn't matter how big or small you are. Doesn't matter if you're sick, healthy, or elderly. No.
There is absolutely no drug on the market that's given in a one-dose-fits-all situation.
We don't put other things in the water to try to keep everybody's blood pressure down or everybody's stroke risk down. And there's no reason why we should be trying a one-size-fits-all approach for this either.
There's no way you can give out a medicine without being able to control the dose. And one dose cannot fit all, and you can't give a medicine to everybody. You are forcing it on people who don't want it. We have the right to informed consent to medication. That's a very important right. This is a violation. It's being violated every day in this country to over 200 million people.
My question to you, to the panel, is if the EPA, from what we understand, has found evidence, and they've stated this, that fluoride is a neurotoxin, neurologically, what really is it doing to us? Could you enlighten us on that a little bit?
A study panel for the EPA, you're absolutely right, listed fluoride as amongst 109 chemicals for which there was significant evidence of neurological effects.
It has definite impact on the neurons, which is the nerve parts of the brain. You don't just grow those back. It's not like, well, I cut myself, so now I'm renewing my cell. It doesn't happen to the neurons.
There are so many ways that fluoride could be damaging the brain. We know this from animal studies.
Dr. Phyllis Moulinex exposed rats to fluoride to work out its effects on the human brain and the central nervous system.
What we did was we exposed them, let them drink the fluoride in the water for 6 to 20 weeks. The pattern that we saw, it typically is what we see with other neurotoxic agents that are well known to cause a hyperactivity or a memory problem or an IQ problem. When I first presented the results of these studies, one of the individuals sitting and listening to the results, he says, "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" And he says, "You're telling us that we're reducing the IQ of children."
Look, the first opponents of fluoridation in this country in the 1950s were biochemists. These biochemists had used fluoride in their experiments to poison enzymes. And they, including Dr. James Sumner, who won the Nobel Prize for enzyme chemistry at Cornell, and he said, fluoride poisons enzymes. You don't want to put this substance into the body. Poisoning enzymes is what makes people sick. Poisoning enzymes is what kills people.
And can cause everything from cancer to depression. So, yeah, it's a serious issue.
Fluoride is obviously not for everyone.
FDA in 1997 required manufacturers of toothpaste to put this warning label on it and only use a little pea-sized amount, which is about the same amount that would be in a bottle of water, and then say, go brush and be sure and spit out, Johnny. And if that amount is swallowed, call the Poison Control Center or seek professional help immediately. So if I drank a bottle of water, should I call the Poison Control Center too? Well, there's a study from 20 years ago showing infant mortality was higher in fluoridated communities. It causes disproportionate harm to babies because they're little people and they drink a lot of water. It causes disproportionate harm to people who are dependent upon the water supply and cannot afford to buy bottled water or buy a nice fancy system that actually takes it out. Not one manufacturer of formula says, by the way, don't use the tap water. Women, infant, and children, WIC program. We contacted them. They refused to tell mothers not to use the tap water. And you know what she said? It would damage the fluoridation program. Is that the kind of stuff that a responsible parent would be putting in their child's hand?
You're going to get subtle effects on the brain that the parent is not going to notice.
No wonder that our children can't read and write. It's no wonder because we're damaging their brains with a stupid preventive dentistry program that doesn't even work.
We've now found out that fluoride can harm babies, and we also know that it's been admitted that there are other groups that can be harmed by fluoride.
Everybody's dose is different. That's what's critical here. Your dose, my dose, an African American's dose, a Hispanic, we all have genetic differences. And that process window may be this big, but you know what? They've decided that everybody gets the same, and that's where the problems happen. There's no single dose that is good for everybody.
The president of the Coalition of African American Pastors has said, why wasn't the black community told that blacks are disproportionately impacted by harm from fluorides and fluoridated water? Nobody told me until I learned about this a year ago. It is a racist policy that causes disproportionate harm.
The Center for Disease Control in the 2005 report indicates that black Americans and Mexican Americans had a higher rate of dental fluorosis than white children.
There is a gene that African Americans have too, and so their intestine is grabbing the lead with both hands, and then the Hispanic kids just have one, so they're just grabbing the lead with one hand, and the Caucasian kids don't have either one. So the lowest level of lead is actually in the Caucasian kids, and then Hispanics up 400%, and the African Americans 600% when you put silicon fluoride in the water, and that's because they have a genetic predisposition, which makes water fluoridation with hydrofluorosilicic acid a crime against humanity. And it's time for them to stop. What it does, it causes minorities, especially lactose intolerant minorities, to suck up lead like a sponge and end up with learning disorders and be imprisoned for violent crimes. That's fluoride gates. They said, oh, 4 parts per million is perfectly safe for everybody. Well, one's not even safe for the baby, and they just lowered it down to 0.7. Well, they're headed in the right direction, but not fast enough. When they get it down to 0, I'm going to be okay with that. But otherwise, you know, it's not safe. The children in the United States, in fluoridated communities that have severe dental fluorosis, partly from the fluoride tablets, which shouldn't be on the market, partly from swallowed toothpaste, partly from eating things like Cheerios that are 10 parts per million fluoride, partly from drinking the water.
The federal government today recommended lowering the levels of fluoride in your tap water because of growing cases of spotting on the teeth of American children.
The recommended reduction is 0.7 parts per million.
0.7 is not going to solve the problem because you can do the math on a baby. 0.7 is going to poison the baby. Not quite as fast as 1 did, but 0.7 is still going to poison the baby because the dose exceeds the dose that's known to cause harm. And you know what the next dirty trick they're trying to do? They're raising the EPA's estimate of the dose that causes harm. I'm sorry, didn't we just figure out that there's a bunch of children with funny looking spotted teeth and we needed to lower their exposure and you're going to raise it?
We have behavioral studies and we have 24 IQ studies, 24 studies which now show an association between fairly modest exposure to fluoride and lowered IQ.
They've actually got it down to a 1 milligram dose of fluoride causes a 0.59 loss in IQ points. The average IQ is 100. So if you're 95, you're in the back of the class napping because you can't understand what the person in the front is saying. And you're going to get a nice job pushing the broom around. So what if you got twice that dose? Okay, you're down to 90. So what they showed in studies in other countries is that you lose all your genius out of your society. You've damaged the intellect.
But new research from China supports Dr. Mullenex's conclusion that fluoride affects mental development and IQ levels.
I've heard a great deal about a chemical that can be used on the teeth to help prevent decay. Is that a good thing to use?
It certainly is. We use a fluoride solution, and we have evidence that for some people...
50 years ago, American government scientists had clinical evidence that fluoride affected the central nervous system. But all this was kept secret.
Chemical? You're going to put some chemical in my mouth?
All mention of the effects of fluoride on the central nervous system was stopped.
In my view, fluoride is where lead was in the early 70s. That argument lasted about 10 years, and it was finally proven that, yes, low levels of lead, lower than caused visible symptoms, was in fact damaging a child's mental development. I think the same thing's we're going to find with fluoride.
And so when you damage the IQ of the children, you lose your place in the country as a leader, and we have. And that's because of the damage that our government has allowed to happen to the intelligence of our children.
Pesticides operate in a lot of cases because they have fluoridated compounds.
Sadly, the dentists have begun to add fluoride to their filling materials, their cements, they even put a varnish on children's teeth. I don't believe these have been legitimately FDA approved. I've checked on them. There's no new drug applications on file for fluoride to be ingested, and none have been submitted. So if you're going to give a child a dose of fluoride, show me the FDA approval where that's beneficial and even safe. It doesn't exist.
Fluoride is now in thousands, and I really mean thousands of products where it has worked its way in, and I don't understand why.
If there wasn't research out there that's shown conclusively that it affects the brain and the neurons, that it affects the immune system, that it affects the bones, and it is incorporated into your body, fluoride bonding is strong. You get something with fluoride bonded, it's not easy to get it off. Well, what's going on?
The problem is anything with water in it has this toxic chemical in it, fluoride.
Once you get fluoride in, it's hard to get it out.
So whether it be milk, juice, mustard, ketchup, cereals, it's in everything. When you water your plants with tap water that is fluoridated, the plants take it up, then you end up eating it. You can't boil it out. Distilled water has fluoride in it as well. You can't evaporate it out. The only way to get it out is to have it turned off.
And that's what we need to get into our heads. And there's nowhere to go in the world to get away from this. But the world water crisis will face us all. But if there is going to be one single thing that is going to slam us into reality, it is going to be running out of water.
You're using water from an ecosystem in Northern California, transporting it through long pipes and canals to
Southern California. And LA is part of what I call hydraulic civilizations, like Rome
and its aqueducts was a hydraulic civilization. But there, the longest aqueduct was 60 miles. The longest you have to go, once measured it, is 1,400 miles from the furthest source of water for LA to a home in the town. And LA has not yet figured out what its limit should be. I mean, it doesn't want a limit. In the LA area itself, which is about 18 million, if it was on its own water, it would only be 3 million. First thing LA is going to do is try to put a lot of farmers out of work and close down the farms and take that water.
California is now in their 4th year of severe drought, and a dozen communities in northern and central California may run out of water in 60 days. Sacramento's rice crop, Napa's vineyards, and the citrus groves of the San Joaquin Valley have been hard hit. 420,000 acres of farmland went unplanted this year, totaling a projected financial loss of $2.2 billion.
Governor Brown and his party recently signed a package of bills to regulate groundwater. Local governments will now have the authority to restrict groundwater pumping, shut down wells that have been paid for and drilled by private citizens, plus impose fines and penalties on private landowners. The unfortunate reality is the leadership in Sacramento used the drought as a political tool to control all California's water. Now the bureaucrats who control all the water can direct it wherever they want and make the taxpayers front the billions it could cost. Instead of building more storage capacity, they can halt those projects. Instead of feeding our crops and cattle, they can direct the water to save the fish. While these new bills may now be California law, it's not too late to continue to fight to protect our private property rights.
Based on the amount of families seeking social services, UC Davis professor Richard Howitt predicts the drought will obliterate 17,000 farm worker jobs. A numerical allocation-based rate structure is being created by state and local water agencies for homeowners. Californians would be assigned a number for maximum indoor water use and another allocation for outdoor use.
The long unused word rationing became a threat in many communities and reality in some others. Conservation, in fact, began to be so effective that local water agencies with billing directly related to meter readings were faced with a decrease in revenues. To offset the deficit, rates were raised, thus supplying less water for the same or even more money. This created a circumstance sometimes difficult to justify to the consumer.
Actions that deny residents the ability to bathe, hydrate, or prepare meals for themselves and their families create costly, long-term public health challenges. These water cutoffs are not only inhumane, but economically short-sighted.
The most famous conflict occurred in the Owens Valley, and Mulholland was the head of the water department there, and noticed that it was pretty much a downhill run to LA in the 1920s. And so he got together a whole bunch of investors to divert all the water from Mono Lake and send it down through an aqueduct to LA. It put the farmers out of business, and there was a big, violent rebellion. In 2 different instances, tried to blow up the aqueduct. They partially succeeded once, and then they were arrested, and then they sent in kind of goon squads to get rid of the farmers, and then they paid them off. When Arizona sent in the National Guard, because California, again, was building a dam across the Colorado to divert the water to California without giving Arizona any. But it led to the Secretary of the Interior to stop the dam.
Now, we put out a lot of carbon dioxide every year, over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to 0. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to 0. This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to 0. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. If you gave me only one wish for the next 50 years, I can pick who's president, I can pick the vaccine.
Multiple overseas media outlets have reported on the fact that polio vaccines linked to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and his Gavi Alliance have on record caused nearly 48,000 children in India to suffer neurological damage and become permanently paralyzed. Most recently, over 50 African children from Chad also began convulsing after receiving a Gates Foundation-funded meningitis vaccine that specifically targets African people. Those children, some as young as 7, have also subsequently become paralyzed.
We see daily cash grabbing via new taxes called levies, supposedly because we are cash strapped in this state, and at the same time see big project spending that does not fit with the message that we are in financial crisis. But we the people have to tighten our belt, while the government seems absolutely unaware and unconcerned of the amount of debt that it is accumulating. This in turn means that taxes, levies, fines and other penalties increase, as well as the cost of living rising exponentially, and the ordinary citizen's ability to exist well is compromised with almost every law that we pass.
This bill was written in a tortured way to make sure CBO did not score the mandate as taxes. If CBO scored the mandate as taxes, the bill dies. Okay, so it's written to do that. In terms of risk-rated subsidies, if you had a law which said healthy people are going to pay in, it made explicit that healthy people pay in and sick people get money, it would not have passed. Okay, just like lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to getting the thing to pass. And, it's the second best argument. Look, I wish Mark was right. We can make it all transparent, but I'd rather have this law than not. So it's kind of like his reporter story. There's things I wish I could change, but I'd rather have this law than not.
By surveilling every citizen's home using census records, aerial and satellite surveillance, and even the medical records, the state of California can fine $500 per violation after Stage 1 emergency regulations were passed in July. Felicia Marcus, a chairwoman for California's Water Resources Control Board, says their reservoirs are low, and half of the state's water storage is gone.
In the winter of 2012, from about November to February, we were at what's called 200% above normal rainfall. California's funny the way we measure measure hydrology. So we say 100% is normal, and if you're at 200% above that, that means you're double normal. And we had this extreme, what we call a above normal scenario for about 62 days. And during that time period, the agencies came in under agency discretion and said, we're going to stop all water from moving from north to south during this extreme flow period. Lost 857,000 acre-feet of water. And what does that translate in real terms? That's the entire annual water supply for the Los Angeles basin. That left our reservoirs throughout the state at low levels because they weren't allowed to recharge during that high rain and snow period, and they were continually being sucked down during 2013 just to meet basic demand throughout the state. So when we went into 2014, we actually went into it in a deficit because our reservoirs were already at record lows going into a period of little to no rainfall, and now no recharge. So this is a drought on top of a drought. Our reservoirs in 2014 are at the lowest levels they've been in many cases since construction. And even when we did receive some rain and snow here in the early parts of 2014, agencies and operations, both at the state and federal level, were allowing water to move through the delta out to sea at a rate of 150,000 cubic feet per second to 250,000 cubic feet per second.
Santa Monica's City Council is in the first stages of implementing a 68 gallon per person per capita restriction for every home with 4 people. Fines may apply beyond that allocation, and Santa Monica averages 88 gallons per person per day as it is now. According to the Los Angeles Times, Downtown Los Angeles is the driest in its history since record-taking began in 1877.
As Agenda 21 became more and more apparent to me, the government was now declaring war on its own citizens. And that goes back as far as 2008.
In 2009, lawmakers passed an $11 billion water bond measure that never went to a statewide vote. It was filled with earmarked pork that had nothing to do with water. Some of the $2 billion in environmental earmarks included bike trails and recreation projects for Lake Tahoe, projects to improve community sustainability, buying land for nature conservancies, for interpretive centers, education programs, river parkways, and other projects with no direct connection to the stated intent of the water bond. But the most unbelievable pork project of the 2009 water bond was $250 million to pay for removing 4 hydroelectric dams in the Klamath River that provide clean energy to residents of Northern California and provide much-needed water storage for agriculture and local communities along the Klamath River. The bond even included money to soften the economic loss to local communities impacted by dam removal. This begs the question, why in a state desperate for more water storage would taxpayers pay to decrease water storage by removing these dams?
Ladies and gentlemen, the origins of the environmental movement as we see it began back in 1968. The main purpose of this think tank was to formulate a crisis that would unite the world and condition us to the idea of global solutions to local problems. In a document called The First Global Revolution, authored by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider, on pages 104 and 105, it stated, "In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers, of course, will be caused by human intervention that will require a global response." That's the origin of global warming, ladies and gentlemen.
And I'm going to ask you half a dozen questions. Here is the first question, and Diane is going to read it out to you.
Does climate change?
Right, hands up all those who do not think that climate changes. Diane is going to tell me how many people don't think climate changes.
No hands.
So we have, ladies and gentlemen, 100% consensus that climate changes. Cook et al. 2013, eat your hearts out. Now then, read this one out too, number 2.
Has the atmospheric concentration of CO2 increased since the late 1950s?
Right, hands up all those who do not think that the concentration of CO2 has gone up since the 1950s. Diane, how many hands?
No hands whatsoever.
Another 100% consensus. Go on to question 3.
Is man likely to have contributed to the measured increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration since the late 1950s?
Hands up all those who disagree with that proposition.
No hands.
No hands. Number 4.
Other things being equal, is it likely that adding CO2 to the atmosphere will cause some global warming?
Anybody disagree with that? No. No hands again.
No hands.
Number 5.
Is it likely that there has been some global warming since the late 1950s?
Anybody disagree that there's been warming since the late 50s?
No
Once
hands.
again, no hands.
hands.
Very good.
Is
And
it
this is the last
likely?
one.
Good. Is it likely that man's emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases have contributed to the measured global warming since 1950?
Anyone disagree with that? Once again, no hands. Now, you may say, why have I bothered to ask these actually fairly crass questions, which are an insult to your intelligence? That is because we are all too frequently accused of not accepting any of those points. And I wanted it to be made absolutely plain to those who are watching this from afar that we are not climate change deniers. We do not deny that climate changes. We do not deny that CO2 is increasing or that we are somehow responsible for some of that. We don't deny, therefore, that we could be causing some global warming. So get that clear. Climate skeptics are not skeptical of the things we're accused of being skeptical of. And I need your help with this one, because as you know, one of the biggest arguments against us is there's a consensus. as though this was some kind of an argument. Can we all practice that? There's a consensus. Now, Aristotle, 2,350 years ago, some of you are old enough to remember, actually said that argument from consensus was a species of feeble-mindedness known as a logical fallacy, one of the commonest logical fallacies in human discourse. They said that 97% agreed that humans are causing global warming. In fact, they say we are the cause. We would say, the only difference is we would say we are a cause. But we have 100% consensus. But look at the results of this survey of 11,944 papers in the scientific literature published between 1991 and 2011, a period of 21 years. Now, on the slide that you see there now, you will see three separate definitions of consensus. The first one, that humans can be causing some warming, is the definition of consensus that all of us agree with. We have 100% consensus, they only have 97%. Now, the next definition of consensus is that most of the recent global warming since roughly 1950 was caused by us. Now, on that, I suspect there will be much less unanimity in this room because we do not know what fraction of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. And yet, when Cook et al. Reported their results, they said that they had found a 97% consensus to the effect that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. That was their definition of consensus. It is the same as the IPCC's definition of consensus. It's the official definition of the climate consensus, that we are responsible for most of the warming since 1950. Now, I'm not going to ask you your views on that, because as good scientists, you don't have one. It might or might not be true. But let us, therefore, look at how they managed to present what is actually a 0.3% consensus in the reviewed literature on that question as a 97.1% consensus. The first thing is they eliminated 2/3 of all the papers they were looking at on the grounds that they hadn't expressed an opinion. Now, that is not normally how these surveys are done, but that's what they did. They knocked those out. Then they congregated together three levels of endorsement, only one of which was the majoritarian endorsement that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. They lumped that with the explicit or implicit endorsement of the consensus that we all agree with, that maybe we have contributed some warming and we don't know how much. They put all those together, and by conflating these two completely different definitions of consensus, they claimed there was this consensus of 97.1% that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us. They said so in their paper, and they said so in a subsequent paper commenting on their paper. And it was only when my good friends David Lee Gates, Willie Soon, and Matt Briggs and I got together, did the math, and published a paper in Science and Education showing what the true figure was, that the truth began to emerge.
In 1992, former President of the United States, George Bush Sr. said, "Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals, and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources. I want everyone to consider what the words profound reorientation of all human society and unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources actually means."
As Americans, our property rights matter. Land, buildings, and material goods are the means by which we live. Without rights over our property, we have no rights over our very means of survival, and therefore we are no longer free. Our founding fathers knew this and declared our rights unalienable, meaning no person could ever take them away. So critical are property rights that our Constitution protects them in the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Individual rights and freedoms are two elements that make America exceptional. Not all nations think that way. Our Constitution says that man's rights are inherent to his nature as a man, and as such are unalienable. This is in direct opposition to the UN Declaration, which holds that man's rights are granted by other men and therefore can be taken away by men. Our common future. It is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This sounds fine until you read the report. It states, poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems. It then blames nations like the United States for consuming too much and having too much wealth, much of it in the form of private property. The report concludes the only way to make the future sustainable is to reduce America's living standards and transfer our wealth to developing nations. Sustainable Development's political agenda originates in the UN's founding documents. This is not surprising, since many of the nations represented needed a point of agreement to rally around. The UN Charter provided that. Whereas our Declaration of Independence protects our citizens and their labor, the UN Declaration grants government the authority to withhold your property for the good of the community. To implement sustainable development in the United States, unalienable rights such as the right to property must be eroded or struck down altogether.
For everyone here tonight not familiar with Agenda 21, I would suggest that this is the beginning of your learning curve, not the end. In 1992, Maurice Strong, Secretary General of the UN Earth Summit, said, "It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, use of fossil fuels, ownership of motor vehicles, small electrical appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable." Put those statements together with the previous one, and it must become clear that Agenda 21 is about controlling every aspect of our lives: how we eat, what we eat, how much we eat, how we move around, food production, the amount of food, and where we even live. This shift will demand that a concern for the environmental consequences of every human action will be integrated into individual and collective decision-making at every level.
And I'm going to ask 10 questions this time, and all you have to do is put up your hand if you have seen a reference to any of these in the mainstream news media. And we're not going to ask you to read them out each time. All you've got to do is stop me as I flick through them, and if you see a hand going up, don't stop me otherwise. All right. So here is the fact that since 1990, the global warming, as measured by just about all the methods of measurement, has risen at exactly half the central rate then predicted with what was said to be substantial confidence by the models. How many of you have seen that published anywhere? How many of you have seen it published anywhere that it might be for as long as 17 years and 10 months that there has been no global warming at all? Once again, one or two people only have seen that. Let's take number 3. How many of you have seen it in any mainstream news medium that sea level might actually have fallen in the 5 years shown on the graph there? No, I didn't give me many hands on that one. Here is another one, that both the extent and the trend in global sea ice has shown very little change in the 35 years since the satellites were looking. How many of you have seen that reported anywhere? Just one hand, I think, perhaps 2. Here is another one, that hurricane activity over the last 5 years or so has been at its lowest in the entire satellite record. No, not many hands, though, a small number over there. I think mostly to do with Mr. Gray, who knows everything. Then, he's a lovely man, incidentally. Then, how many of you have seen it reported, a recent paper, that the fraction of the Earth under drought, the land area under drought, has been declining for 30 years? None at all on that one. And that windmills can kill big game birds. More of you have seen that one. We're beginning to get through on some of these points. And then that methane has been increasing its concentration, but at below the predictions of all the 4 previous IPCC reports. How many of you have seen that? No need for a cow fart tax. Only 1 or 2 have seen that reported. Number 9, how many of you have seen it reported that there is substantial evidence in the literature, and here is one of my favorite examples, Grinstead et al., sea level rise reconstructed over the past 1,000 years, put against the original IPCC representation of whether there was a medieval warm period and a little ice age. There's a relatively good match, which means at least there might be a causative connection. That certainly doesn't match with the hokey stick graph, which I won't want to say anything more about. So has any of you seen the possibility that the hockey stick graph might be wrong and that the IPCC's original estimation that there was a medieval warm period, a little ice age, and temperatures today are not particularly much to write home about? How many of you have seen that in the mainstream news media? Hardly a hand, perhaps no hands.
No hands.
No hands. And finally, how many of you have seen it reported that the supposed 97.1% consensus that most of the warming since 1950 was caused by us is actually a 99.7% consensus that they have said no such thing? Not a single hand.
So what we're here to define tonight is Agenda 21 and how it is being implemented in your general plan.
Dixie Ray, former Washington State Governor and Assistant Secretary for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs, stated, Agenda 21 seeks to establish a mechanism for transferring the wealth from citizens to the third world. Fear of environmental crisis would be used to create a world government and UN central direction. From a report in the 1976 UN's Habitat I conference, land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset, controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, therefore contributes to social injustice. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, if you work hard and you exercise good financial management and invest in property, you are contributing to social injustice. In a report from the President's Council on Sustainable Development, we need a new collaborative decision process that leads to better decisions, more rapid change, and more sensible use of human, natural and financial resources in achieving our goals. And at the same time, Harvey Rubin, Vice Chair of the Wildlands Project, says individual rights will have to take a back seat to the collective.
So what's going on? So that's today, right? Well, what happened 22 years ago? Where was Jerry Brown 22 years ago?
What we have to do here is to organize an entirely new political force to overcome the obstacles to environmental standards.
All the way back that way, heads of state all across the world are meeting. Jerry Brown is there right now. In fact, he's a keynote speaker on several occasions, and he's there right now. Brown said California will meet its goal of reducing carbon emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, and within 6 months will set a new goal for 2030. What do you think your general plan is all about? This. Here's what Jerry Brown is quoted as saying. So these goals, that will be more ambitious, that will require more technology, and will also require heightened political will. He's not kidding. He's saying we are taking this to another level.
Why do I say that? Because they're also going after rainwater. Yes, they've arrested a man in Oregon on the basis that he cannot collect his own rainwater. Sound incredible? It's true. Today, Jackson County, Oregon says it's your rainwater, and the country has sentenced a man to 30 days in jail and fined him $1,500 for the supposed crime of collecting rainwater on his own property. On that land, he has 3 ponds, and those ponds collect rainwater that fall on his land. Common sense would say he has every right to the ponds with the water on his property, but common sense has been all but abandoned. And here they are arguing that once it heads towards natural waterways, it's no longer your water, no longer the Earth's water, but the government's water. But the issue is, in fact, bigger than that. But I would point out, this has been in the media for over a week. I've heard the audio commentary from this guy, Harrington, and he's quoted in part as saying, when something's wrong, you just as an American citizen have to put your foot down and say, this is wrong. You can't just take away any more of my rights from here on in. I'm going to fight it. As you well know, they're going after everything from backyard gardens to lemonade stands, raw milk, Amish growers, Amish dairy people, you name it. They're coming after individualism in this country because they're pushing collectivism. Now, according to Oregon laws, one must obtain a permit in order to have a reservoir. But Harrington had the permits for the reservoir. In 2003, he was granted the permits, but the state reversed the decision, then come along to seize his rights to collect water, and now we're putting him in jail, which he's basically going along with as an act of civil disobedience, as an act of saying if you're going to be a tyrant, then you be a tyrant. But why is this a bigger issue than just rainwater collecting in Oregon? Well, it's because since at least 2010, they've been doing it throughout the Southwest, many western states. In this previous article, collecting rainwater now illegal in many states as big government claims ownership over water. Another Mike Adams article. He points out how many western states, including Utah, Washington, and Colorado, have outlawed individuals from collecting rainwater, calling it an unlawful diversion of rainwater. What turning of natural rights, of common sense, all on its head, and claiming that government has the default rights to something that comes naturally on the earth instead of an individual. That's the reverse of the way the Constitution was written and understood, where all rights are kept to the people and to the states, except those very few that are enumerated and specifically given to the limited federal centralized government. All that has turned around over these centuries, and now collectivist big government assumes the right until you're proven innocent, until you're proven to have some kind of individual right for something as necessary and basic to survival as water. But it just freaks me out that they could tell us we can't even collect rainwater on our own property. Total invasion of property rights. So you can see whether it's privatization where they want a monopoly of profits or the state where they want a monopoly of power, they're not interested in individuals having an alternative, in this case to rainwater, because it cuts into their domination.
J. Gary Lawrence, advisor to President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. This segment of our society, who fear one world government and UN invasion, through which our individual freedoms will be stripped away, would actively work to defeat any elected official who joined the conspiracy by undertaking Agenda 21.
In order for Governor Brown and Republicans who wanted to increase the state's supply of clean and reliable water to gain the support of environmentalists in the legislature, millions of dollars of environmental pork had to be added to the measure.
So we will call our process something else. We will call it comprehensive planning or growth management or smart growth. We ended up with sustainable development. The redeployment of human and financial resources has now become visible to us all via the cut to services and programs to assist the sick, the young, the elderly, and of course the creation of another level of poverty now identified by the term the working poor.
It all sounds so civilized, doesn't it? Here's the less politically correct but more accurate version. A group of liberals with more money than many governments have just decided how many people will be permitted to live. This group of self-appointed governors will now have to draw up criteria to be used to decide who will not be permitted to live and how they will die. It can and will be dressed up in polite and civil terms, but in the end, it means certain people will have to die.
We're constantly paying for so-called services that we don't receive. This is wealth redistribution at the grassroots level. Everyone needs to remember, we all pay a natural resource management levy on our tax rates. So this is not just going to affect the food producers. The intrusions into our property that Peter was talking about that land producers are going through will roll out into the suburbs and into the city because they have the authority to do that.
Who has read your general plan? Because I think that's an admittance of something, huh?
This government has been working overtime to take away our rights to common law through many pieces of legislation. Common law is what guarantees us an ability to correct injustices. It's also ventured into the rights of people to own and retain their property and manage it without government interference. In particular, the laws around, as Peter said, water allocation, natural resource management, the Native Vegetation Act, Development and Planning Act, which are all equally toxic to our food producers, as they are to our long-term security, we city dwellers. This coming year, I promise you, you will also hear debate over a number of pieces of legislation that will further erode our common law rights.
It is true, a lot of the water is in the north and a lot of the people are in the south. That's why my father passed Proposition 1 on the 1960 ballot, and that's been a marvel for California. It's created jobs and abundant agriculture and made California #1 in fruits and vegetables. But we've got a problem here. We have a delta system that protects the fresh water that goes to the farms, that goes not just to Southern California, but to Alameda County and to Santa Clara County. And that salt water is only protected by dirt levees. We have to find a way to make sure the conveyance through the Delta will withstand an earthquake or rising sea level or extreme weather events. And that's why for 50 years people have been trying either a peripheral canal or tunnels or some other kind of conveyance. We now have a plan. And the plan is going through the environmental impact process. Very extensive, 75,000 pages of analysis. It's not cooked yet. We're still taking comments. So over the next year, we will go over that. We'll look for if anyone else has another suggestion. But I'm telling you, the way we protect the water in the middle of California and in the south while balancing what is right for the north and the water rights of the Northern California rights holders, it's going to take something like the Proposition 1 that will be on your ballot.
I'm very concerned about the tunnels. $25 billion for these tunnels, and the Obama administration has serious concerns. Look, if you look at Governor Brown's legacy of infrastructure projects, take the Bay Bridge, many billion dollars over budget, many years late. If that's the track record, this thing is going to cost $50 or $75 billion by the time we're done with it. I'm an aerospace engineer. When I look at a big engineering project that's way over budget and way over delay, I have real concerns about mismanagement. I'm not going to plow ahead with $25 or $50 billion into the tunnels. We're going to put a brake on that, study it, make sure we get it right.
This has been on the table for 50 years.
Okay.
If that salt water intrudes, half the water to Silicon Valley will disappear in a matter of days. And that would be a catastrophe for the economy of California. And I don't think this man really understands what's at stake.
The Obama EPA is saying that your tunnel program is fundamentally flawed. That's your own president, President Obama, who's saying that, not me.
Doesn't make it right, by the way.
Governor Brown has said we need CEQA reform, the environmental laws that are stymieing business investment. And then you threw in the towel, Governor. You said it's too hard, it can't be done, it's God's work, but we can't do it. So instead, you try to give one-off deals to big companies that hire high-priced lobbyists.
And the reason is climate change is a global challenge. It's an existential threat to our way of life.
What this means is that every region will now be responsible for finding its own water source, and private companies are ready to sell. In Southern California, the renewable resource company Cadiz has tapped an aquifer that sits beneath 34,000 acres of the Mojave Desert. With 6 utility companies already eager to buy, Cadiz has the necessary permits to start drilling and proposes piping 16.3 billion gallons of water into the Los Angeles basin.
Make no mistake about it. He's raising your gas prices, you at home, he's raising your gas prices to fund his vanity project. Make no mistake about it. I'm an aerospace engineer. I believe in the science behind climate change. His plan is designed to raise the cost of electricity for working families, to raise the cost of your gas prices, to try to make alternatives more competitive. It is not fair to wall up working families by raising their gas and utility prices. And then the insult to injury, he's taking the money from that program to fund his high-speed train, which the LAO, the Legislative Analyst's Office, has said will not do a thing to help the climate. Look, all of these policies are well-meaning. But this is why jobs are leaving the state. This is why we have the highest poverty rate in America, 24% poverty. How can that be this great state? It's because we've done this to ourselves. It's about, what about the kids in California? We have finite resources. Who's going to stand up for the kids in California if the governor of California refuses to fight for them? You had a choice between fighting for the civil rights of poor kids and fighting for the union bosses who funded your campaigns. You sided with the union bosses. You should be ashamed of yourself, Governor.
But the real problem here is that not enough water reservoirs are being built to supply the amount of people who move to California every year. And if the state turns off the water, then how are residents and agricultural businesses going to survive? Zachary Taylor, a state assembly candidate running for California's 46th district, believes the answer lies within the free market.
I think we can usher in an age of awareness by showing people that they have the ability to make gains on their ability to conserve water.
This November, California will vote on a water bond officially named the Water Quality Supply and Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2014. With the state facing some of the worst drought conditions in decades, a water bond to fix the problem seems like a good idea. You might be surprised to learn how much of this water bond is actually drowning in environmental pork. Of the $7.5 billion bond, only $2.7 billion is directly allocated for new reservoirs and other water storage projects. The next largest allocation is $1.5 billion for environmental pork projects to protect waterways and wildlife. 10 conservancy agencies will have access to $298 million that has nothing to do with increasing water supply. In fact, the Coachella Mountain Conservancy plans to use $10 million in water bond money to preserve hills and sand dunes between Palm Springs and the Salton Sea. The San Diego River Conservancy plans to use $17 million for bicycle and pedestrian trails. And the Water Quality and Supply Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2014 includes money that can be used for dam removal on the Klamath, a direct contradiction to the stated intent of the bond measure.
Look, we don't have money, it doesn't grow on trees. And as a result of that, we're only spending $2.7 billion on water storage. When Republicans and Democrats said we should be investing in schools, Governor Brown said no. Again, if we're spending $70 billion on the train, it crowds out all these other investments that we need to make. But my commitment to the people of California, if I'm elected governor, I'm going to cancel the high-speed train, and I'm going to invest in water in a very real way. You know, Governor Brown's own father led a major infrastructure investment in water all around the state. He understood, Pat Brown understood how critical water is. If I'm elected governor, I'm going to invest in water, not the train, because water and schools have to come before the high-speed train.
Unfortunately, the limited funding in this measure dedicated to infrastructure for water storage will only increase water storage in the state by 1%. It's shameful that environmentalists are using the state's water crisis and this bond measure as a tool to mislead voters to fund projects the state can't afford and doesn't need. California desperately needs new water storage, but we don't need a bond measure that is drowning in special pork projects and may actually decrease water storage in the state if dams on the Klamath River are removed. That's common sense.
But here we are now, openly talking about Agenda 21 and the ramifications we will see in a short period of time if this is not stopped in its tracks. Up and participate in the democratic process, and to do that you need to understand the political system that you are trying to rein in. In 1972, published the alarmist Limits to Growth document, warning of worldwide overpopulation, the need for sustainable development. This was the beginning of the slow process of social engineering and programming people to accept that the planet is struggling to sustain life. On the 8th of October 1973, the New York Times reported a quote from Ted Turner: "The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history." In 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev said, "We are moving toward a new world order, the world of communism, and we shall never turn off that road." He also quoted in 1996 Monetary and Economic Review on page 5, "The environmental crisis will be the international disaster that will unlock the new world order, one world government." In 1992 came the Earth Summit, which produced the document called the Earth Charter. This document was co-written by Maurice Strong, long-time globalist, elitist, and Mikhail Gorbachev. Both Strong and Gorbachev stated that it was hoped that this document would be adopted as the new 10 Commandments, with environmentalism as the new one world religion. Out of this summit came Agenda 21. Ted Turner was quoted as saying in 1996, "The total population of 250 to 300 million people is ideal. That means a reduction of 95% from present levels would be even more ideal." Anyone who abhors the China one-child policy is simply a dum-dum. In 1998, the Baltimore Sun reported on July the 7th, most of Ted Turner's first donation to the UN of $22 million went to programs that seek to stall population. Another goal of the depopulation process is that the upcoming generation will submit to sterilisation to save Mother Earth.
The world is going more and more deeply into a general breakdown crisis, which would probably result in the elimination, within a generation or two, of 2/3 of the present level of the world's population.
This is Deagle.com, and the information that you're about to see is absolutely mind-blowing. As you can see here, Deagle takes their information from a lot of government links and sources. Deagle lists pertinent facts for 209 countries, including gross domestic product in US dollars millions, military expenditures, the power purchase parity in US dollars, as well as the US dollar. And we have 209 countries ranked. What you're going to see here for the US is going to blow your mind. As you can see, we got US 2013 information, population 316 million, 33 inhabitants per square mile, a gross domestic product of $17 trillion, and a military budget of $726 billion. Let's go down to the forecast for 2025. What do we got? How did we get from 316 million in 2013 to a forecast of 69 million in 2025? How are we going to be going from 316 million inhabitants in 2013 to 69 million inhabitants forecast for 2025? Now, for those who think this is some kind of mistake, we can go check out some other countries. We're going to go ahead and look at China. China goes from 1.4 billion to forecast for 2025, 1.4 billion. Our concerned reader is from Norway. Norway's interesting as well. In Norway, they expect the population to drop from 5.1 million to 1.9 million, a GDP drop of 516 billion to 73 billion. What's going on here?